Alright guys, we are back looking now at chapter 35. This will be the final chapter we're going to cover in our period 7 of AP curriculum, AP US History curriculum. For this year, 2019-2020, this will be the end of our curriculum. We're not going to cover periods 8 or 9 because of the very strange time we live in when we're all sitting at home staring at screens. So again, this will be the end of our curriculum for this year. Period 7. Here we go. World War II. That's our big topic today. So World War II, huge topic, massive topic, incredibly important topic, something we can't cover every last little detail of, but we're going to try to hit the highlights. And our big goal is to figure out how this war changed us, changed our society. And change is the key word there. We're going to hear that a lot as we go through World War II. We're going to begin by looking at a pretty regrettable event from World War II. And it's one you guys have all heard of before. It's the famous Japanese internment camps. This is a result of Executive Order 9066. An executive order is not a law passed by Congress. It is basically a decree issued by a president. So FDR issues this order. And the goal here is to round up over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast and put them in so-called internment camps. 2/3 of these people being rounded up are U.S. born. In other words, they are American citizens. There's a term for these Japanese Americans who are born in America. They're called Nisei. These people are going to lose property, wages, dignity, you name it. And the fear was that these people might be operating somehow as spies or saboteurs or assisting the Japanese army somehow in this war. All right, fifth column, that's just simply a term for people who are kind of lying in wait in a country ready to wreak havoc by doing sabotage. And in this Dr. Seuss, yes, Dr. Seuss cartoon, it tells us they're waiting for a signal from home, and they're on the West Coast. And if you look at this image, I mean, there's definitely something uncomfortable about this. We have a minority group being rounded up under armed guard, put onto trains, and shipped off to camps. That's a rather awful image to think about in the context of World War II. We're also going to see a lot of anti-Japanese propaganda really go well into the full-fledged racist mode in World War II. You can see some of these images up here just, frankly, way over the top. Of course, I say that as a person from the 21st century and not a person who lived through Pearl Harbor or something like that. So certainly the people of that time period had a different perspective. But nonetheless, these are pretty awful images to look at. You can see a map here of some of the key relocation, not internment, but internment, of course, camps. And there you are. Now, thousands of young Japanese American men will be drafted from and volunteer from these camps to go fight in World War II. I'm sure for many of them a chance to prove that they were in fact loyal Americans. Now, you're probably thinking, this sounds pretty unconstitutional. How can you round up one group, ship them off to camps when they have not been convicted of any crime? Well, this goes all the way to the Supreme Court during World War II, and in the Korematsu case, it was decided that in fact this internment situation was constitutional. The argument of the Supreme Court was that in times of war, national security concerns can outweigh the right of individuals. So the needs of the many over the needs of the few in this case. All right, let's kind of shift now and look at building up this war machine. And of course, we've already got a head start on this with things like Lend-Lease. We've already been producing a lot of stuff. But now we're right into the war. It's official. It's time to, gear up full speed for the war effort. In World War I, we saw several organizations established to help guide the U.S. war effort. And in World War II, we're going to see some of these as well. The most important of these would be the WPB, the War Production Board, and this is basically, they're going to oversee the whole industrial retooling to full-fledged war mode. And the numbers of things produced in World War II are just mind-boggling to think about. I've got some numbers over here for you. Some 40 billion bullets produced, 300,000 aircraft produced. I mean, you can just go down the list. Just tremendous numbers of stuff. And if you stop and just look at one of these numbers in particular, think about it. Think about an airplane, just how much stuff there is in an airplane, all the wiring, the metal, every nut and bolt. I mean, think about all that stuff that goes into one airplane, and then multiply that by 300,000. This is going to be a tremendous industrial effort to win this war. That means stuff that's not considered essential has to be limited, in fact, maybe even restricted altogether. For example, no more passenger cars being produced during World War II. So there were a handful of cars built in early 42, and then the assembly lines stop as those factories turn over to producing things like tanks and airplanes instead, and there won't be any civilian cars being produced again until late summer 1945, the very tail end of World War II. We're also going to institute a national speed limit. And, of course, we're going to have some gasoline rationing to make sure we have enough fuel for us and our allies. And national speed limit, if you're curious, guys, a whopping 35 miles per hour, which, as you can imagine, not a speed limit a lot of Americans wanted to follow. And, at least from these headlines, it looks like quite a few of them weren't following. You're urged to take fewer trips, and if you are going to take a trip in your car, make sure you combine trips with other people. Carpooling, we would call this today, because when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Now, there's a huge economic danger of having, pretty much everybody back to work, getting paid lots of money for their work, and then not having a lot of stuff to buy. So you have huge demand, very little supply. Of course, you're thinking, hopefully in your mind, this would result in inflation. And to keep inflation in check, the Office of Price Administration is set up, the OPA. Their goal is to try to keep a cap on prices through rationing, but also having things like ceiling prices. As you can see from this menu, they're only going to be able to charge a certain amount for that food, and that's the legal ceiling that they can sell those goods for. Rationing, we've talked about this already with World War I. We all know how this works. You're going to be issued basically a certain number of goods you can purchase, whether it be milk or cheese or gasoline or whatever. It's controlled through the government, so you have to have your ration stamps and your money to purchase the good. If you don't have the stamps, you can't buy it, no matter how much money you have, at least legally. There was, of course, a huge black market during World War II. You could probably get your hands on something if you had to, but you'd be breaking the law if you were buying this outside of the OPA. To try to encourage people to produce their own food, to get around rationing, Americans are urged to plant so-called victory gardens. Victory gardens. You're going to win the war by growing tomatoes and potatoes or whatever. And you can those, and you're good to go. You don't have to worry about rationing. All right, let's look at manpower, woman power. In other words, people, putting their life on hold to pursue the war effort. And I looked this up a little bit ago, and the current U.S. military, if you put all the branches together, we're talking about a little over 1 million, maybe upwards of 1.5 million people in uniform today in 2020. Back in World War II, our military swelled to the size of 16 million men and nearly 250,000 women. So pretty much everybody knew someone in the military. Now, our population today is about twice the size as it was in World War II. So if you want to kind of equate this to modern day, we're talking in upwards of 32 million Americans would be in uniform, which is just mind-blowing to even think about. Everybody knew someone in uniform in World War II, including this guy who happens to be my grandfather. No joke, that's really my grandfather. He was in World War II. Now, with all these people off fighting the war and in uniform, we need more people to do the labor that has to be done. And so in 1942, we are going to work with Mexico to bring in Mexican farm workers. They're called braceros. And braceros, their job is to go out and harvest the crops, vegetables and such out in the West, places like California in particular. And they're going to contribute to the war effort by just simply doing the labor that has to be done to keep people going in this war. Now, the influx of lots of Mexicans into California is going to lead to some racial problems. And the most infamous of these would be the so-called Zoot Suit riots of 1943. And the reason they called it the Zoot Suit riots has to do with what this guy right here is wearing. It's called a Zoot Suit. And a Zoot Suit was really popular among young Mexican men, or at least people of Mexican ancestry anyways. And it's, it's baggy pants, the super elongated jacket, big hat. It's very flamboyant. And this was controversial for a couple of reasons. The most obvious reason is just the racial component, that white Americans were frankly kind of suspicious of all these young Mexican men here in America now. But it's also the fact that if this is the time period of conservation and rationing, this guy's wearing enough clothing for probably 3 suits. And so you combine the racial element plus the perceived lack of, I guess, patriotism behind the war effort because of the clothing he's wearing, and you have the recipe for racial riots. You can see our white sailors here going out looking for some people to punish, I guess, if we could say it that way. You can see the Zoot Suit here on this Los Angeles Times article. Well, women are going to take a lot of jobs outside the home in World War II. We all know this. Rosie the Riveter comes to mind, of course. In fact, there is a woman doing that riveting. And some 6 million are going to take jobs outside the home, which is a major shift from say, the 1930s. There's Rosie. Riveting. Women are also doing things like serving as truck drivers. They're working on railroads. They're also doing piloting jobs. Now, they're not, of course, going into combat missions. That was forbidden in World War II. But what these women are doing is they're ferrying these planes from the factories to a forward base where the men would then take the planes and fight in combat. So it frees up men to fly in combat missions rather than flying planes from factories. So the women are doing kind of they're kind of the middle men, or I guess middle women, in this job. This is a picture from World War II, not from America. This is a picture from Britain, ironically enough, and it really, I think, illustrates just what a big role women played in World War II across all nations, not just America. And this happens to be a very young future Queen Elizabeth II, the current British monarch. There she is in uniform in World War II. Now, sometimes I think we might overblow a little bit just how many women went into the factories. The vast majority of women, of course, did not leave the home. They continued life as they always had. But, again, millions of women did go into the factories. About 2/3 of these women, however, are going to leave those factory jobs after the war and return to their more traditional roles. So Rosie was important during the war, and she certainly, I think, helps sort of begin the modern women's rights movement in some ways. But at the time, she was not exactly, well, at least in the immediate post-war era, she's not as probably as remembered as she is today. One more note on the home front I thought I'd throw out there. You've heard of Gold Star mothers or something like that. So during World War II, the tradition was that for the number of children you had, men, of course, mainly in World War II, head off fighting, you would put a star on a banner you'd hang outside your window in your house. And they were blue stars for every one of the people off fighting the war. And if one of them perished, you would make that a gold star. So this person obviously has lost one of the 3 people they have off fighting in World War II. All right, we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up with wartime migrations in the next video.